is the strongest scale that you can have. Suppose you have a study with dependent variable. I'm going to make another example. Dependent variable that is ordinal. So you are either in the first row or in the third row. And then suppose that you have two independent variables, one that is ordinal and the other one that is ratio. What are you going to do? A chi-square test or a logit analysis? Because you have two different independent variables that have two different scale. Now, between the two, you choose to go for logit analysis. And why is that? Is because the second independent variable is measured on a ratio scale. And the ratio, I just told you, that wins on all the other type of scale. So it wins over an interval, it wins over an ordinal, and over a nominal. So between the chi-square and the logit, you would choose logit because ratio wins over the ordinal scale, the ordinal variable. And you do not have two ratios. So I said that as a dependent variable, you have ordinal, and then as independent variable in a given study, you can have perhaps an ordinal and a ratio. You choose logit because a ratio is stronger than ordinal. If that would be in the example I made before, with a dependent variable that it's a ratio and two independent variables of which one is ordinal and the other one, let's say nominal, and the other one is ratio, then in this case you would go for regression analysis, because also in this case ratio wins over the nominal because ratio is the strongest. But that could be also the case when you are comparing interval versus nominal. Interval is strongest than the nominal, so the interval independent variable will determine which statistical technique to apply. Is this clear to everyone? Should I repeat it again, or you want clarification? Okay. Let's move on with the next question. So still about inferential statistics, we have discussed perhaps chi-square tests. This type of statistical technique, apparently it's new to some of you, or to all of you probably, but the idea is that you don't have to you don't have to look it up ourselves, how to use it, or how to analyze it, because this is not the objective of the course. So at least for this course, you are not required to do so. What you have to know is when to use it. That is, if you have a nominal ordinal independent variable or nominal ordinal dependent variable, then you are asked to, you should know that you have to use a chi-square test as statistical technique. Then anything else that is not in this table for chi-square test, you shouldn't know anything about it. At least, again, not for this course. Now, choosing between t-test or ANOVA. So as I told you in the web clip, this choice is based on the levels of independent variable. There is a bit of uncertainty on what the levels of independent variable mean, and therefore I'm going to clarify this now. So first of all, we are at the second row. So when you have to choose between t-test or ANOVA. First, both ordinal and nominal scales consist of groups or categories. And these different groups of the independent variable are called levels. That is, for example, gender has two groups, meaning two levels, which can be female and male. Or for the independent variable food spiciness, then that type of variable will have three groups, or also called three levels, which are hot, hotter, and hottest. So this is what we mean when we say that each that the independent variable can have different levels. You can also call them groups, but we use the terminology levels, or at least I think I mentioned levels in the web clip, but you can also call them groups. Was this clear to everyone? Because we received quite a few questions about it. So this now a bit better. Can you just type in the chat yes or no? Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so also we will practice with this also in the tutorial. We will see what also some variables that have levels, or as you want to call them, groups. So you will have time to practice this also this week in the tutorials. Now, interval, the difference between interval and ratios. Some of you, so Salam, there is another slide I wanted to include it, but I forgot, which tells you that as like a structure of which one to choose depending on the number of levels. So keeping that in mind, when you have t-test, when you have to choose between t-test or ANOVA, you should know it by heart for the exam, so that is important. But indeed, when using here the example hot, otter, odd test, then you should go for ANOVA. Okay, so I was saying that we also received a lot of questions about the temperature example when talking about interval versus ratio. So your questions might not be listed here, but if you asked about the difference between interval and ratio and the temperature example, this is the answer for it. So the main idea behind is that the difference between the two type of scales comes from the ability to dip below zero. So for the interval scales, there's no true zero. And the variable can represent values below zero, while for the ratio, these type of variables usually never fall below zero. So as an overall idea, if we go back to the example of the temperature. So the difference between the two is the ability to dip below the zero. If we take the temperature example, what happens is that, suppose that you have two rooms, one with air conditioning at 16 degrees and the other one with with air conditioning degrees at 32. What you cannot do is that you cannot say that one room is 2 times hotter than the other one, because that would mean that you are taking into account as a reference point the zero. So what you can say is that one room has 16 degrees more than the other room, but you cannot say just because one has 16 degrees and the other one has 32, you cannot say that the second room is twice as hot, because then it means that you would take into account zero as a reference point where to start counting. But again, what you can say is that the temperature in one room is 16 degrees higher than in the other room. For ratio scale, zero is instead an option, so you can use zero as a reference point. So perhaps a ratio scale can be age. If I tell you I am 25 and you are 50, what you can imply is that you are twice as my age, because zero is the reference point where you start counting the age. What you couldn't do with a temperature, because zero cannot hold as a reference point, you can actually do it with age, but you can do that perhaps also with weight. If someone's weight is 60 kilo and someone else's weight is 120, you can say that the second person weighs 2 times the first person. Because 0 is the reference point where you start counting, and there's no discussion about what is the 0 in that case. In the temperature example, perhaps the 0 in Fahrenheit is not the same, it doesn't mean the same as the 0 in Celsius type of measurement of degrees. So you cannot hold the 0 as a reference point for the temperature. I see that there are some questions in the chat. Luca, in temperature you have absolute 0. Yes, but the 0 is a value, right? So you can go below the 0, because also -1 is still a temperature. -2 is still a temperature. When you talk about age, you don't say that you are -1 year, because the 0 is it's like a starting point, a reference point where you start counting.
So maybe I can add on to that.
Yeah,
so what
yes,
you can
please.
say is that we say that something is a ratio if there is, we say that something is an interval if there's, the 0 point is basically arbitrarily chosen, meaning that there's different opinions on what the true 0 is, such as, for example, with the temperature, there is some discussion going on, because indeed what you say for the Kelvin scale, they say it's the absolute minimum ever measured, while in Celsius we say 0 is the point where water freezes, right? So there is discussion possible about what the 0 actually means. So that's why, by definition, that is an interval scale. If we have a ratio scale, then there's no discussion possible. So for example, if I haven't moved in my entire life at all, that means that I have traveled 0. As soon as I take 1 step, assume that I take steps of 1 meter. I don't, but that makes things easy. If I take 1 step, that means that I've traveled 1 meter. If I take 2 steps, that means I've traveled 2 meters, which is twice as much as 1 step. So then the ratio actually means something, because 2 steps is twice as much as 1 step. I can also give that example with height. So height would be a ratio, because everybody agrees what 0 is, and it might be so everybody agrees if there is nothing is existent, then that's where 0 starts, right? And some people call it inches, some people call it centimeters, but there is that natural 0 point that everybody agrees on. Also holds for money. As soon as I have some money to hold in my hands, that means that I have something, and somebody with 100 euros has twice as much money as somebody with 50 euros, for example. So kind of the same explanation, but in different wording. Does that help? Depth. Do you mean depth as in the width, length, depth, or? Yeah, so that's ratio, because we can measure that in meters or feet or however you prefer, but yeah. So basically it's everybody agrees on 0, and that 0 equals nothing. That's how I usually remember it for myself. And because of that, the ratios of the numbers actually mean something, because then twice as much actually holds value. More questions about this topic?
Yeah, we had this discussion with Alke. When we talk about money, we refer to, do not consider the case of debt, because of course, if you have debt, you go below 0. But in the case of a normal case of money where you have 0 euros, you have 0 in your hand. As soon as you have a bit of money, then you start counting from 0, the amount of money that you have. But do not think about money in terms of debt that you can have. Otherwise, it makes it too complicated, the idea behind. What are you referring to, Bezira?
Yeah, you should know them by heart. So the table with the chi-square, logits, etc. You should know that by heart.
Yeah, this one, yes. Yeah, So you should be able to understand first which type of scale each variable has, and then mixing and matching the scales in order to decide which statistical technique to use. Yeah. All right, other questions about this? Okay, then I move with the sampling. So this was the second part of the web clip of today. So we were asked about giving an example about cluster and to explain again what cluster sampling is. So if you, for the theory behind, again, we say it's a two-step probability sampling technique. So, and two-step because there are two steps that you have to take in order to get your sample. So first, the target population, you divide it into mutually exclusive and collectively exhausting subpopulation, which you call clusters. And then you take a random sample of this cluster, and the selection is randomly, it's based on probability sampling techniques such as simple random sampling. Now, the example about it could be, suppose that Albertine wants to get insights in their customers' behavior inside the stores. So what they do is to divide the Netherlands into the zip codes, the existing zip codes, and each zip code is a cluster which contains a certain number of Albertine stores in it. Then they just select randomly 20 of these clusters. So 20 of these clusters. And what to do after is just that this selection is randomly based, and you can base that on simple random sampling. So what you do with cluster is that then these selected, the customers within these selected clusters will be heterogeneous for the other customers in other clusters as well. Okay, Elena, 1 second, I come back to your questions. First, is for the student who asked me about clusters or to everybody else, is that more clear? Should I explain it again with example? So first, Albertine has, they want to get inside in the customer behavior, so they divide the Netherlands into zip codes, and then each zip code has a certain, let's say, 10 stores in it. These zip codes are called clusters, and then what they do, they just select randomly some of these clusters, and they take that as a sample. Okay, that is clear. For the question in the chat, in the exam, something like this is asked, whether money is ratio interval. How do we know that is a ratio if we believe that debt can go below 0? Now, you can consider money, you can consider money as a ratio. Then for the explanation I give, the idea of the question of the answer I gave to Effie is that for the explanation I give, you can think of the depth, but for the overview that Elke gave, then you consider money as a ratio variable.
Yeah, because 0 really represents nothing. It's really the start.
Yeah. Okay. Then judgment sampling. Elke, do you want to explain this?
Yep, sorry, I was in the chat. Judgment sampling. So there was a question about where for judgment sampling. So the example of selecting the only CEOs from multinational companies, and it said that this is limited in generalizability. And the question was, why is that? So let me briefly sketch this situation again. So as a researcher, what you want to do is you are interested in, for example, all employees from multinational companies about, for example, the culture of the company, so company culture. But you feel like you can extract most information about a select group of experts. So you, as a researcher, really judge that the CEOs are the ones that have the most valuable information for you, so you can most efficiently gather your information. So therefore, that's the judgment in there, of course, because I, as a researcher, judge who is most relevant. And after that, what you want to say is, okay, so I believe that the opinion of these CEOs gives a good idea of the actual culture of companies. However, of course, CEOs do not represent all employees of multinationals. It might be that people, lower managers or people working on completely different parts of the company, that they feel very differently about the culture. So as such, the CEO's opinion cannot be generalized. So therefore, it's a non-probability sample. So it's used because I can quickly gather a lot of data, because you would say on average CEOs know quite something about the culture. However, it's not representative, so we cannot generalize it. So it's a non-probability sample, because I do not even include all different types of employees in my sampling frame, but I really decide for myself, these are the ones that I will focus on. Maybe a different example to help you understand a little bit better. For example, PepsiCo wants to know how their drinkers feel about a new taste that they want to put into the market. They feel that instead of asking the average drinker, so instead of going for simple random sampling, for example, out of all people who ever purchase Pepsi Coke, what they will do is they try to approach the people who drink Pepsi Coke the most. So these are the experts. They probably have a strong opinion. And they think that from this select group, so these experts on their drink, they actually will receive the best feedback on these new flavors that they want to introduce. So again, they get very valuable information from this select group. However, it's not non-probability, because they decide for themselves who they think gives them the most relevant information. So it's efficient, but they cannot generalize. Yeah, so Luc, that's definitely one differentiating factor. So in the setup, the difference is, of course, first, I have my entire population. Everybody has a chance of being selected. And then you select randomly. Yeah, and one of the other four situations, you select people. So what you say is then, because I randomly select out of the entire group, I can generalize. For the non-probability sampling, usually I choose people out of convenience. So for convenience sampling, or because of my own judgment sampling. But that means not everybody has a chance of being included. Hence, it's not generalizable. Yeah, sorry. So also, for example, the CEO example, I switched around with a CEO example. So it might be that you select CEOs from the multinational company and you want to know what their stress level is. However, you want to generalize to all CEOs. But also, again, it might be that CEOs of smaller companies, or at least non-multinational companies, might feel different levels of stress compared to CEOs of multinational companies. Does that answer the questions? Okay. And Evia, also your question? And Luc, by the way, I think after that, all of the questions are covered, right?
Yeah, I think so. Can you guys type if it's clear enough? Vesela, I'm going back to that question once I'm done, because otherwise I run out of time and we need to cover other things. Then at the end, when everyone leaves, I can go back to that part. Okay, you want to take the question of Effia?
Of Asia?
Chat.
I was already typing it. So
okay, perfect.
That is considered one disadvantage. Yep.
So I can continue. Okay, so other questions we received are about the coverage error versus the sampling error. The difference between the two is that coverage error means that members of the population of interest are not in the sampling frame. So the coverage error is usually part of the sampling error and creates an even larger error, while the sampling error it means that the estimates are produced from only a subset of the population of interest. So the sample therefore does not include all members of the population. Now, for the coverage error, suppose that as an example, suppose that a researcher is using Twitter to determine the opinion of US voters on a recent action taken by the US president. Now, although the researcher's target population is US voters, he or she is using a list of Twitter users as a sampling frame. Because not all voters are on Twitter, and because not all Twitter users are voters, then there will be a misalignment between the target population and the sampling frame that could lead to a coverage error. Now, when we talk about coverage error, we also refer to under coverage and over coverage. In the example of Twitter, the under coverage might be that voters are undercovered because not all voters on Twitter, not all voters are Twitter users. So not all US voters are actually using Twitter. So under coverage, of course, when the sampling frame does not include all members of the target population. For over coverage, in the Twitter example, it might simply be, for example, that someone has more than one Twitter account. So these members with more than one Twitter account are overrepresented in the sampling frame because it might be that they're taken into account twice. So that's an overrepresentation of some members in the target population. Remember that the sampling error you always have, almost always have a sampling error, and then it's only about how large or small the sampling error is based on your study. But it's often it's often present, almost always present. So then you just have, based on the study that you have to understand whether this error, sampling error, is big or small, and in case so, how big or how small.
Yeah, so I would say the only way to avoid a sampling error is by basically to not sample, so include the entire population. So you say, I have 100 people in this population and I will include all of these 100. But as soon as you only have like 80 out of these 100 people in the population, then you already have a sampling error because there's a difference between the people in your sample and the people in the population. Hence, there might be a difference in opinion or behavior between the sample and the population.
This was the last question we received. So do you guys have any other question? If you don't, you can leave the session. If you do, you can stay and we'll answer your questions. We can also stop the recording now.
Recording stopped.
Is someone of those that are staying have any questions? The quota sampling exam. Oh, the quota sampling
It's-
example, yeah.
It's not in these slides, right? But I think
Yeah.
I know it by heart.
Yeah.
So basically, I don't remember the numbers by heart though. So I'm going with some random numbers here.
I think it was
So-
60-40, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, 64, slide 64. Or, yeah, 20% and 80%, right? Yeah. And then
Yeah, 28, okay, yeah.
So what you do basically based on, well, preliminary research, what you know is that approximately 20% of all households in the Netherlands owns a pet. So that's the number that you also want to have in your sample. So I want to have 20 people in there with a pet, 80% in there with a pet. So what will I do? Because it's of course non-probability again. So I will just go on the streets and I will keep addressing people and say like, hey, do you guys own a dog as a first question? Whether they say yes or no, well, I select them in my sample. And I will ask them, how do you feel about paying taxes for owning a dog, for example? I know that I want to have 200 in total, so I should have 40 people owning with a household with a dog and 160 people without a dog. So as soon as I have 40 people saying, yes, I have a pet, the next person coming in saying, yes, I have a pet, you will just let them go. You will not include them in your research anymore. So at that point, you will only use answers from people not having a pet. So you basically want to make sure that the number 40 is full for your sample and the number of 160 is full. And then you have your complete sample with the correct division. Does that help to clarify? Good.
No. Other questions? Effie, difference between, so it means that you, conveniently available, we say. So when using probability, the difference between probability sampling and non-probability sampling is that in the second case, not all members in the population have the same chance of being chosen, while is instead the case for probability sampling. So.
Yeah. So if you want to do probability sampling, you need to have a good quality sampling frame. Because if you have a good quality sampling frame, that means that you have all of the members of the population, and then you have the option to randomly select out of that sampling frame. If you do not have a good sampling frame, automatically you have to go for non-probability sampling. Yeah, and Charlie, so that's going back to the dog example again. Indeed, because you do have that 20/80 division in your sample, but still probably you're just in the streets, for example, in here in Rosmalen. And I don't think the people in Rosmalen are representative for all of the other Dutch people. So there might be the 20/80 division of dog owners, but they still don't accurately represent Dutch dog owners.
Is the difference between coverage error and sampling error also in the scale of error? What do you mean by scale of error?
Can I unmute? It would be.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Hello. So I was wondering, because on the slide there was written that coverage error is part of sampling error and creates an even larger error. So I was just wondering if the difference also is in this scale, because I don't think I get the difference between them.
But what do you mean by scale of error?
Yeah, I mean by...
Yeah, how large the error is, I guess, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
so
yes.
maybe it helps if with a different voice. So coverage error basically is the difference between my sampling frame and a population. So not everybody is covered in my sampling frame. And the sampling error is the difference between my sample and my population. And of course, because I only select an X amount of people out of my sampling error, out of my sampling frame, that means that the sampling error will be larger than the coverage error.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you very much.
Good.
Any other question? Otherwise, we can close the session. Okay, then thank you for joining. I will see you in the tutorial of this week. Thank you, Aske.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.